Dr. Maria Yellowhorse Braveheart. She is Sunspapa in Oglala, Lakota. She is the Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of New Mexico in the Division of Community Behavioral Health. Dr. Braveheart has also been an Associate Professor at Columbia University and the University of Denver. She is the founding President Director of the Community Network Institute, previously based in Rapid City, a Native collective devoted to community healing from intergenerational massive group trauma. So, here's Dr. Braveheart.
I just with my relatives, and it's really good to be here. And so I still chase the buffalo around all over the country, but I know that I'm always where I'm supposed to be. So I've been at different institutions, and at the University of New Mexico, I get to work, really focus on tribal communities, so that's really, really positive. That's one of the reasons why that sort of fell into my lap, that opportunity. So I'm going to talk about the historical trauma and unresolved grief and the development of the intervention. And I think I'm pretty coherent. I woke up this morning with this like killer migraine, but I've been drinking tea and eating some things well and drinking a lot of water. And I joked with my buddy and relative Tuffy Sierra, and you'll see him in the video at the end, that I said, if I have to rush out to the restroom, you can be backup. So anyway, I'm also from the black and white TV generation. So I'm not I'm just amazed at this technology. So this is by way of sort of introducing this topic. This is something that we actually got off the internet. So it looked like it was public domain, but I don't know where to really give acknowledgments to this. But this sort of sets the stage in terms of the historical trauma. So you can look at the land loss as sort of just a visual to where we are today. So, and this quote might be a little difficult to read, and I realized that I might need my glasses. I will get those out if I need. But this is something that we have permission to use, and just talking about the loss of the land being traumatic. Can everybody see that? So you can just kind of read that yourself, and I'll just highlight a couple of things just about what happened to our people in history and the boarding school trauma for many people. And at the end, it sort of describes the grief. There's a big hole in my heart. We see it happening to our grandchildren already. Where does it stop? So that's kind of what we want to do, is to stop this process and begin to heal. So, and of course, in the boarding school era, there's the Army Colonel Henry Pratt, who was the one who started the Carlisle Indian School, which was the first national Indian boarding school. There were some other church-run boarding schools in the East, primarily earlier than that, but this was one that was national and became the federal policy. And so one of the things that Pratt said was, in order to basically save the man, you had to kill the Indian. And there's another issue with boarding school that's that I learned much later on in reading some of the social policy books and history books, and that's that boarding schools were developed also as part of trying to break the traditional value of collective land holding, or really caretaking of the land, so that then the land could be reduced, the amount of native land in native hands could be reduced, and then the rest opened up for white settlement. And so part of the Dawes Allotment Act was linked with boarding schools. And that's something that I hadn't heard of, and I think, but don't quote me on it, it was somebody named with the last name Pruka who wrote some social policy books that talked about that. So we always hear about boarding schools as being forced assimilation and turning people into dark imitations of white people, those kinds of metaphors, but I had never seen any reference to this link to deliberately getting at the land as part of the idea behind the boarding schools. And then the loss of child-centered parenting, and in a Native context, because that was something that was ripped away from our people, torn away from our people. And there's a real negative message underneath that in terms of the boarding schools. That, there's something wrong with your culture, you can't raise your own children, we have to take that responsibility over for you, as a government saying that. And so that really undermines our roles, our traditional sacred value of protecting children and putting the children at the center of the nation, and then having someone else do that for us and tell us that you can't speak your language, there's something wrong with your spiritual practices. And we've internalized that over generations. So I like to use the word genocide because some people sort of try to modify it and say cultural genocide if they use genocide at all. But I think it's really important for us to say that. It's much like with somebody who's surviving trauma, like surviving child abuse trauma or sexual abuse or rape, to be able to have someone they can talk to about the trauma they've experienced and be validated and heard and supported. Because victims often tend to self-blame. Children often blame themselves for abuse, and they think that something's wrong with them. And part of it is this idea that, well, if I change myself, then I can control this and keep this from happening again. Or a victim of domestic violence. If I had just baked the chicken instead of fried it, he wouldn't have hit me, kind of idea. So victims tend to start taking on that view of the person that's perpetrating the abuse or oppressing them. So it's really important that with genocide and people's experiences of that we acknowledge that it's true and it did happen. So there's some literature now that does go through the Lyman lectures, I remember. It's amazing what I can remember sometimes and what I don't, but in a studies policy journal in, I think it was around 1988, Lyman lectures, Legters, he talked about Native history, and he went through all of those tenets or pieces of the United Nations 1948 Geneva Convention on Genocide, and really supported how Native history met all of those points, so that technically we are survivors of genocide. And it's interesting that the United States did not sign that Geneva Convention until the 1980s. So there's some speculation about why was that, and that's because the United States has been involved in genocide globally, somehow, sometimes supporting that, but also in terms of Native genocide in this country. And so part of the hesitancy of signing things like that, and the United States did sign the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples, that declaration, but they were one of the last remaining 4 countries to do so and kind of drag their feet. So there's sort of legal implications, and I think it has to do with the concept of reparations, perhaps, that if they acknowledge the genocide, then they'll have to pay up, perhaps that's part of the fear. There's other theorists that talk about acknowledging that somebody is not native to this land is something that people don't like to do, because you hear people say Native American, and sometimes they're not talking about Native people and indigenous people, they're talking about that they were born in the United States, so they're a Native American. So it's acknowledging that they came from somewhere else and that has certain implications. So the Bureau of Indian Affairs Education Division used to be called the Civilization Division, and of course most people know that the BIA used to be under the War Department and then was transferred over to the Department of the Interior, but all during parts of the last part of the 1800s in the congressional record, there's debates about transferring it back to the War Department. And I actually read those. I had the opportunity to read those. So some of these quotes that I'm sharing or talking about, I had the opportunity to read. So when Congress moved from negotiating treaties to changing that in around 1871, they passed a resolution that basically said that they should know that the U.S. would make no further recognition of native rights to the land over which we roam, and that we are to go upon said reservations, and we have no alternative but to choose between this policy of the government and extermination. So that's in that congressional document, which is more validation that genocide was part of the plan, part of the intent. And then the impairment of gender roles and relationships, being a woman or being a man in a traditional Native context as we define it for ourselves, was also something that was impaired. Because when the boarding schools were first established, women and children were the property of men in England. And there was a book on one of the laws in the Book of England, or whatever it's called, the law books of England, that there's something called the rule of thumb, where that expression rule of thumb. And what that comes from is that a man could not beat his wife with a ruler any thicker than the width of his thumb. So it actually said that domestic violence was legal, and the concept was that men owned women and children. That's something that was totally foreign to many Native communities, not just the Lakota, but many other Native communities too, where women had traditional political and spiritual power. Women were consulted in tribal council decisions. Sitting Bull often talked to his mother about what to do and listened to her advice. So there was this respect, and that domestic violence was not tolerated. If it happened, the male relatives of the woman would avenge that, and it could lead to banishment or death sometimes. So there are all of these things. Children were at the center of the nation, and hitting children was a foreign idea. But all of those things got learned, and you can sort of trace that to the boarding school era, where that's the culture, that was what was learned, and that unfortunately that many people picked up on. So we all know about health disparities, so I'm not going to really go through that, but just that we have very high rates of health problems in tribal communities. This is actually a slide that comes from a friend and colleague, Dr. Dee Bigfoot, who was Caddo's psychologist at the University of Oklahoma. And she put it nicely together in a diagram in terms of the historical trauma, that cumulative, collective wounding across generations. And so there's a sort of intersection with historical events, ongoing oppression that we experience, and other psychosocial challenges of poverty that affect all of these things. There's actually literature on poverty, that poverty can, children who grow up in poverty, that sometimes they have lowered self-esteem. It creates risk factors for other emotional issues. So, and that's not blaming the victim, it's the way that poverty is stigmatized in this country, and that people are sort of blamed for being poor, like it's your fault if you're poor, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, those kinds of expressions, instead of you just don't have access to resources, and that those resources are sometimes deliberately held from particular communities. So there's reasons for health disparities, discrimination. Sometimes we talk about, what is that expression about IHS? You don't get sick after It used to be after June, but I think now it's probably after February, because they'll be out of contract health care money. So there are reasons for these health disparities that are not the person's fault. It's not tribal communities' fault that these things exist. So we also have a lot of multiple losses and trauma, high rates of trauma exposure. And I know Dr. Jan Beals, Dr. Spiro Manson, I don't remember who else was on one of their recent publications about the high rates of trauma in Native communities and high rates of PTSD. So they were saying that when you sort of adjust the data so that you wipe out some of the socioeconomic differences, that the high rates of PTSD doesn't mean that Native people, we're sort of prone to more PTSD. It just means that we have higher rates of trauma exposure, and that places us at greater risk for PTSD, because the more trauma you get exposed to, the more at risk you are for developing post-traumatic stress disorder. And everybody who's exposed to trauma doesn't develop it. So we don't quite fully understand yet what causes these individual differences. You can have the two same people from the same family, everything's the same, and they go through the same trauma, but one person will develop PTSD and the other one won't. And those kinds of things can be hard to measure, because even if you grow up in the same family, you can really have a different experience. It depends on your relationship with your parents and siblings. It remembers it affects your age, what happened at the time that you were born. Maybe when you were born there was a death in the family, so people were emotionally less available to you because they were grieving than maybe a sibling. So there's lots of factors that come into how it affects us. But just sort of to make the point that we have frequent deaths in our communities for many reasons. We have high rates of accidental deaths. We have high rates of health diseases that cause deaths. And then we're surviving massacres and, for the Lakota, the Wounded Knee Massacre, but other events too that have happened to our peoples, and so that many community members feel that they're always in a state of mourning. They're always going to funerals. So one of the things that's really positive in Native communities is we have these very large extended kinship networks. And if they're working like they're supposed to and like they did traditionally, then you have a lot of emotional and social support because you have many relatives. And in a traditional way, your relatives pray for you and you pray for them. Your relatives help you, you help them. But with alcoholism and sort of all of the erosion and challenges that we've had, and having our culture actually attacked by the boarding school system, and we've moved away from some of that reciprocity, that equal exchange. So then you have part of the Tioshpaye, the extended family kinship network, helping and giving and supporting, but they're not getting it back because that other part is drinking, is not involved in supporting, doesn't want to be involved in sort of traditional ceremonies or whatever practices there are in the community. And so then you have some people who get depleted, just emotionally drained, because they're always giving and giving and they're not receiving. They're not being taken care of. So those are some of the things that we face in our people. So those are sort of things that are the backdrop to the historical trauma work. And this quote really eloquently describes what we talk about when we're talking about historical trauma and historical unresolved grief. So I always like to share this quote with people. And this is from a traditional Hunkapapa Elders Council that was in preparation for the 1990 Sitting Bull and Bigfoot Memorial Ride. And it basically really describes that. And it says, it is our way to mourn for 1 year when one of our relations enters the spirit world. Tradition is to wear black while mourning our lost one. Tradition is to not be happy, not sing and dance and enjoy life's beauty during mourning time. Tradition is to suffer with the remembering of our lost one and to give away much of what we own and to cut our hair short. But Chief Sitting Bull was more than a relation. He represented an entire people, our freedom, our way of life, all that we were. And for 100 years, we as a people have mourned our great leader. We have followed tradition in our mourning. We have not been happy, not enjoyed life's beauty, have not danced or sung as a proud nation. We have suffered with the remembering of our great chief and have given away much about what was ours, and blackness has been around us for 100 years. During this time, the heartbeat of our people has been weak, and our lifestyle has deteriorated to a devastating degree. Our people now suffer from the highest rates of unemployment, poverty, alcoholism, and suicide in the country. So our elders knew that that connection of what happened in the past is affecting us in the present, and there's many reasons for that. And part of it is in a lot of Native cultures, past and present and future are sort of all interconnected, and there's teachings about you can pray forwards and you can pray backwards, to heal backwards and heal now and then heal into the future. So time is fluid in many traditional Native cultural thinking. And so that means then that things that happened in 1890, just for example, are as if they happened yesterday. There's another group, some of this is also related to other group trauma. So in the Jewish Holocaust community, for example, there was a theorist named Judith Kestenberg she was a clinician and a Holocaust, I believe she was a Holocaust survivor herself, but I'm not 100% sure. A lot of the people who went into working with the Holocaust, doing clinical work in mental health, were survivors themselves, and now there are a lot of children of survivors that are doing that work. But she came up with a concept called transposition. And what she meant by that is living in the past and the present at the same time. So she found that a lot of people she was working with experienced this sense of having a foot in two worlds, not in the present, but meaning the present and the past. So that your part of you is still like back in 1890, for example, and another part of you is today, but another part of you might be still in a boarding school or your parental, your parents' experience. And so that those kinds of things pass on. She found that people would have dreams of things about concentration camps, for example, that their parents never talked about, and somehow they knew. Some of them had eating disorders, and then she found through working with these kids that unconsciously it was kind of like they were identifying with the starvation that their parents experienced in the concentration camps. So there are other communities where these kinds of features are also something that we see. So this is a quote from a Lakota parent in recovery from alcohol, which we have permission to share. And he makes the point about intergenerational trauma getting passed on from the parents to the kids and then to the grandkids. And he said, I never bonded with any parental figures in my home. At 7 years old, I could be gone for days at a time and no one would look for me. Never been to a boarding school. All the abuse we've talked about happened in my home. The sexual abuse, the neglect. Maybe if it had happened by strangers, it wouldn't have been so bad. And then he said that then he could blame it all on another race. So his parents were boarding school survivors. They learned to drink in boarding school, and they were both physically and sexually abused in boarding schools themselves. And so they were passing this on to their kids, and he was about to do this with his children, pass this on, but he sobered up and started to understand this whole process. So the definitions, these are the definitions that I use for historical trauma, and it's cumulative emotional and psychological wounding across generations, including one's own lifespan. So cumulative is, if you think of, since most tribes, well maybe not most, but many tribes have casinos now, I'll use an updated metaphor. I used to say Dagwood sandwiches. So some of you will remember the Dagwood cartoon. But which is then I went to, a double Whopper, triple Whopper with cheese for layers. Then now I go to deck of cards. So a deck of cards, if you think of each card as a trauma, a loss, across generations, and then you just have constantly, one piled on top of another. That's cumulative. You know, if you take all of those cards, you have a long stretch of things happening. So that it's something that's collective, meaning it happened to all of our people, even though not each person individually experienced all of that trauma, but because of our relationship with one another, it affects us too. So that collectively as a group, like many other massively traumatized populations in the world, we have experienced generational trauma over and over again. And so it becomes something that's layered. It's like a layering. So with that is loss, death, grief. So we have a grief that's associated with that. And then the historical trauma response, which is a response to these features. And I'm not going to go through this long laundry list, and it is, of those features. And some of these things you will see in mental health diagnoses as symptoms, but it doesn't mean that if you have one of those symptoms, you have a mental health diagnosis. It's just that, and they overlap a lot. But that makes research of this kind of difficult, and I'll talk a little bit more about the kind of research that I'm involved with, and which is not proving or disproving the existence of the historical trauma response. This is more from clinical experience, observation, validation from our people that this is, and our healers, that this is true. And also knowing that this is also something perceived by other massively traumatized populations as well. And when we see the video at the end, you'll see it has some footage from the first historical trauma conference we did in 2001, and you'll see other ethnic groups represented in that video who came to the conference. We sponsored it as Native people, but they came and we shared how we work with trauma basically with one another. So, and we found that we have a lot in common, and that we have a lot of potential allies out there in the world who are also experiencing surviving genocide and surviving trauma. So I forgot, I won't bother with the pointer. It's like, I think I had a pointer, I don't know. Anyway, it probably would be too complicated to do. But so I'm going to just point out a couple of these. You can read them. Survivor guilt, most people know about, because that's been in the media, that we're all survivors in this room because we're here. But many of our ancestors, our relatives, are not here with us. And sometimes you feel like, why me? Actually, I just talked with somebody a couple of days ago, a student who had become really much more aware of trauma. And she shared that with me, that she said, why me? You know, like why does she get to have these scholarships? Why is she doing well, but her relatives and her family are suffering so much and still really in bad shape? And this was haunting her, because she felt like maybe she needed to go back home, but she didn't want to, and then she has this scholarship, this opportunity where she can help her people by becoming more educated and then figuring some things out. So that's part of that survivor guilt. And sort of related to the survivor guilt is that loyalty to the ancestral suffering and the deceased. So we're loyal to our relatives, but then we start to identify with their memory, and remembering the pain and the trauma instead of identifying with what's really positive, and their strengths. What else do I want to point out here? One of the things is psychic numbing, and that's, you're basically trying to shut down the pain, but sometimes you end up shutting down all your feelings in the process. So you don't feel pain, but you don't feel much of anything. So you kind of are just numb completely in your life. So you don't feel joyful, you don't feel very loving. You're just sort of, you know, like whatever is the way you go through life. And it's an attempt to cope. And those things aren't bad in and of themselves. Some of these things help us get through an immediate crisis. People will dissociate. That's one of them. Dissociate means is it's sort of like they're cut off from their feelings or cut off from what's going on. Some rape victims or survivors of rape, it's described feeling like they're in a movie during the experience, and like they're in the ceiling looking down on this or seeing it on a screen. And that's actually can be a protective way of handling that trauma. So those aren't bad things. It's just if they continue over time, then it interferes with the quality of your life. And hypervigilance is another thing that it's sort of like you put on, I didn't put my glasses on, but if I had, if you think of those lenses as trauma lenses, and the more you're traumatized, the more you develop this picture that you always look through these lenses, and it's always, everything is filtered in terms of trauma. So that means that everything's a potential threat. So coming in today, for example, you may have come in and you're like excited to come here, excited who you're going to see. Oh, they're going to have lunch. What's good, and just happy about being here. And you decide to sit where you can sit with some friends or where you can see better or whatever. Somebody who's been chronically traumatized over and over again might walk into the room with that hypervigilance, which is in that heightened state of alertness, staying on guard, preparing for the worst, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And so they may have walked into this room and started sizing up the room. Who's here? Am I going to be safe here? Is somebody going to attack me? Where's the door? I want to sit near the door so I can leave in case of an emergency. That's a different kind of thing. One of the examples that I also use is a car accident. And if you've, how many of you have ever been in a car accident? A lot of people, it's a very common occurrence, unfortunately, even a minor fender bender. So sometimes you're driving along later and a car comes from the same direction that the car that hit you, but you're not in any danger, and all of a sudden you jump because it's encoded in your brain. I actually had that experience myself. And I was with my daughter, and they hit on the passenger side, but it was like the front fender. Somebody was trying to, this was in Denver, somebody was trying to go across all these lines of traffic to get on the other side. It was totally illegal. And so they hit my right fender. So a time after that, and we weren't injured. Another thing that I will add to it that's sort of related to this trauma is the concept of microaggressions. And some of you may be familiar with that. It's a concept that's that was developed by a psychiatrist named Chester Pierce years ago, and then Dr. Daryl Wing Su, who's an Asian American psychologist who's at Columbia University Teachers College, kind of picked up the ball again and ran with it, and he has a few books on it now. But it's like those racial slurs and those dinks and the discounting that eat away at us. We get it all the time as Native people. I mean, even just on turning the news on, the exclusion or the parading of the orange suits, constantly repeating and repeating, which are all Native people, these kinds of things that you get exposed to, or racist comments that are made to you, that there's some research that microaggression now and what we call perceived discrimination can impact self-esteem. It can be related to or correlated with more depressive symptoms. So it does have mental health issues. Discrimination is real, and your response to it is real and valid and understandable. So in this case, after the car accident that I had, it was raining. The police had us come and sit in his car, and I had to leave. My daughter was already I'm trying to remember, she was about 12, I think. And I asked her if she would be okay sitting there, and she said yes, and we were, in view, but so we had to go sit in the cop car. And it was a white guy. And I thought, I'm going to be the one to get a ticket. I'm going to be blamed for this. So, of course, I was here. The other guy was honest. And he said, I tried to race her and get across over to get to the post office. So he basically admitted he had done something illegal, going across all these lanes of traffic. So then the police officer said, okay, ma'am, you can go, you're free to go now. So, and then his insurance paid for the damage. But it was interesting, so I observed my own original thought was, I'm going to be the one that's going to get a ticket. It's going to be blamed on me, even though I'm innocent, because I'm Native and the guy's white. But that comes out of the microaggression, the expectation that you're going to have mistreatment because you've experienced it so many times in your life. So that's sort of like staying fixated on the trauma or having that hypervigilance. You're on guard, you expect it to happen. So one of the things, I just want to go back one. Okay. So one of the things, because I kind of didn't put everything on this list, so I did forget to do the last one is really important. It's related to something that a Jewish Holocaust colleague, and you'll get to see a little snippet of her, Dr. Eva Fogelman, who's a child of Holocaust survivors herself, talks about, and she talks about that we have this unconscious identity with our ancestors, but we identify with their suffering rather than their strengths. And so that what we do is then we feel loyal to our ancestors, so we feel like we have to carry out suffering in our own lives. Otherwise, we're somehow betraying them or being disloyal to them. So we can't be too happy, we can't be too successful, we can't have too much, and I'm not talking about taking on non-native values. I'm talking about any kind of thing that's happiness and abundance and joyfulness, because our people are suffering. And so how can we be happy if everybody's so miserable in our communities? So what Dr. Eva Fogelman recommends is basically identifying with the resilience and the strengths and the positiveness. And we know that our people are very funny, we're very humorous, and that's one of our strengths. And so we really need to think about joyfulness and that it's okay to be joyful. And I know that there are times when spirits have given us messages that they're with us and our ancestors are with us in our joy. Our ancestors don't want us to be suffering. They want us to be joyful and vital and vibrant people. And so they don't want us to be torturing ourselves with guilt. I'm going to skip this, but just to say that that the intent of historical trauma work is to try to help our people to heal, not to stay stuck in the past and beat the past to death or stay fixed on it. That's not what this is about at all. But the idea is that if we're carrying this stuff and we're not aware of it, then it can bite us in the butt, so to speak. We'll stay stuck in it because we haven't resolved it and we haven't acknowledged it and we haven't been validated for our trauma. So we formed the Takini Network in 1992 originally, and that was the first historical trauma healing work that we did. And we're really grounded in our traditional spiritual ways, but we respect all spiritual traditions. I think it's a very personal, individual decision and right to practice as you see fit. And whatever spiritual practice works for you, that's what works for you, And so we're not about trying to impose any way on any person. We just feel that for us, that our traditional ceremonies and practices are really, really helpful to the healing process. So I just want to give a brief overview, and then we're going to shift gears and show the video. I've lost track of time. I think I'm pretty close, but so it's really a collaborative process, and there's sort of an intersection sometimes of those processes in terms of the Western lens, but the indigenous lens, Western meaning non-native, basically. So this is our model, basically. There are four main components to the healing, the historical trauma and unresolved grief intervention. So it's first coming to terms with our history and getting all on the same page. And you wouldn't believe sometimes when we've done presentations, I know Tuffy and I did one, in one community, and one of the young men came up. I mean, he was already like in his 20s, and said to us, "I didn't know that happened to our people. I thought that kind of stuff only happened to African Americans." And I kind of looked at him and I thought, "Have you been living under a rock?" You know, it shocked me. But sometimes there's denial. There's denial so that people have heard things, but they don't internalize it, or they can't remember it because it may be too painful for them, or they just didn't get all the information. Like in Holocaust families, for example, they have different types of families that Yale Daniele is one of the people that has identified that. And so in some families, they talk about the trauma all the time. The kids know the Holocaust history, and sometimes to the point where the kids don't want to hear anymore. It's too much for them. Whereas other families, they don't talk about it at all, and the kids then are left wondering, why is our family like this? What's wrong with our parents? Why are we, and these are with the survivors of the concentration camps and their children. And that's the group that Dr. Eva Fogelman has worked with, and it's really fascinating. She's done some videos with permission with people she's doing treatment, doing therapy with, who wanted the videos to be made about their reality and their experiences growing up as children of the trauma and how they felt. And it's really powerful. So that's part of that, getting everybody on the same page and validating the history so people know it's not you. It's not you. You're reacting to this series of events over time, and it's not your fault. It's not your fault. You're not responsible for undoing the trauma, but that's part of the historical trauma response. So understanding that and how trauma affects the brain and the body, then releasing that pain through small and large group processing and sharing and getting validation, and then transcending the trauma. And the video will talk a little bit more about that. And at the center is returning to the sacred path and returning to our ceremony. So we started this in '92, and I started as a clinician, and then I went back to get my doctorate, and I was very blessed that the head of the doctoral education said, "Well, that's your work, and you can just do that for your dissertation." I said, "Thank you. Yes, that's exactly what I wanted to do." So we did that, and we did the evaluation and research at that time. And so we had the findings over time, and then getting some Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration grants. We found that people felt better. In a nutshell, people felt better after the intervention, and they felt less responsible to undo the pain of the past, of what the ancestors had experienced. They felt less shame, stigma, less sadness, less guilty. They increased in joy, and they felt better about themselves and the tribe and their own sense of personal power. So now, fast forward to the present, which only took me how many years to get to this point, but this was a long-term goal. And so we got National Institute of Mental Health funding for this project. And so what we do is we have two different treatment conditions or therapy conditions. So one is interpersonal psychotherapy only, and it's a group interpersonal psychotherapy for 12 sessions. The other treatment condition is the historical trauma and unresolved grief intervention combined with the interpersonal psychotherapy. And some of the reviewers, when we submitted their proposals, said, "Why don't you just do your own? Just do the historical trauma one." But that's really risky in this day and age because it's something that NIMH might not review as having enough evidence, and I didn't want to take that chance, and a lot of people also had given us that advice. Interpersonal psychotherapy is actually, it's a model that's good. It's been used in different cultures, never to my knowledge been done with, or at least evaluated with Native people, but they had, the model that we looked at was done as a group in Uganda with tribal villages. So I felt like it's really malleable and culturally adaptable. So we're in the process now of doing that. So we have people randomly assigned to the different treatment conditions, and we're in our I got myself lost here. We are in our second wave, going into our second wave, finishing up the first wave. So they're randomly assigned, meaning that they're not allowed to pick which condition they're in, but that's clear in the consent form. And we're also confident that everybody's getting something that has been shown as being perceived as positive and helpful. So everybody's getting, so nobody's deprived of getting anything. And so far, see, I have trouble with reversing. This is why this is happening. I kind of get my right and my left mixed up. Sorry about that. So these are busy slides, but next. But I just wanted to let you know a little bit about that, so that people are responding from what we can tell right now, and we're just in the process of analyzing some of that data, but that people do feel that it's perceived and it's as helpful to them. So some of the challenges I just want to mention are lack of resources and infrastructure, which we know is in communities, long travel distances. So we do provide gift cards for every session they attend and every data collection time point, because that really helps people, because people don't have gas money. People, you know how it is, challenging, even in the urban areas. So we have an urban group too in New Mexico, Urban Native Clinic in New Mexico, and even with them there's some challenges with homelessness and some amazing things going on in terms of people really trying to get to the groups. And also that there are tribal cultural differences that have to be respected. Every tribe is unique, and some of these things I'm going to skip because I think there's a lot that know that. So just things about developing an evidence-based practice, which is what we're basically trying to do, is get historical trauma on the map, and now it's on NIMH's radar screen, which was a very deliberate thing on my part, because now tribal communities are required to use evidence-based models, evidence-based practice, empirically supported treatments, which that's all valid, but most of those have been done without even including Native participants, much less Native people designing. We have our own models and our own ways. So that's one of my pet peeves. So I thought if we get more, we sort of get it on the map, and tribal communities can get funding to do these kinds of things. And again, we respect each tribal community's right to adapt. So it's not like a rigid model. There's those 4 basic things that I talked about. And just that it takes time and patience, and very important, the relationship with whatever community you're working with, and be genuine and committed, and that this is really not about your career. You know, I mean, like for a lot of the non-Native principal investigators, and there are some who are very committed to tribal communities, but for probably a lot of others, it's just about, oh, well, it's easy to go study a Native community because it's kind of this combined group, and then I can get all these papers written, and I can get this promotion, and you know, and Native people in academia do have to worry about keeping their jobs, but to do certain things, but that's not why we're, in my knowledge, is that's not why we're doing what we're doing. We're doing this because this is a way to help our people, and that is the bottom line. That's the most important thing, and to honor that. So carrying the people in your heart and making all the decisions with the people in mind, including the next 7 generations.